Good morning. Welcome to Grace Baptist Church. We're glad that you're here for our Sunday school hour. Let's all stand. We'll sing, "I'll Live for Jesus Day After Day."
I've got just a real quick announcement just to update you as far as ABF and moving back down the fellowship hall and that kind of thing. Mr. Weinbarger will finish up Ephesians here the 24th of January, so 2 more weeks after this morning. And then Mr. Habegger will start up with Philippians on the 31st of January, and we will continue to be down here through the extent of his lessons in Philippians, which will be 13 weeks. And then at the end of that, we'll kind of evaluate as to if we're going to move back down to the fellowship hall. So we'll consider that at the end of that, because we really don't want to move the fellowship hall and then back in here and go back and forth. So we'll reevaluate that at the end of Philippians with Mr. Habegger, and we will go from there. All right? Thank you. Mr. Weinberg.
Thank you, Pastor Brent. Good to have you guys here today. Hope you got your fast listening ears on, because we're going to move fast today. Got it, Bob? All righty. I probably have more to do today than I'm going to get done. So if we go into the preaching hour, all right. We have been looking at Ephesians chapter 5 and some of the things that Paul taught to us about as far as family relationships go. He gave us an idea in chapter 5 that we need to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And that is the key thought that we're looking at today, that we must be Spirit-controlled people. And then he talked about this idea that we as Christians need to be submissive to each other. It's called a mutual submission idea. I don't have to have my own way all the time. I can put other people ahead of my own desires sometimes and serve people rather than serving myself. Then he made the practical applications to that on how that works out in the home. He says, wives are to be subject unto their own husbands. He said, the husbands, you're supposed to be subject to Christ. And now he's going to deal with the idea where children need to be subject or in submission to their parents. And he's going to use a word that nobody likes. It's called obedience. You like that word? You know, does that just strike terror into your heart? Does it make you mad when I just say obedience? When I just say obey, you immediately say, you, whatever, okay? Yeah, we don't like that word, but it is a word that he's used several times in this passage. He's going to use it twice here again in this section. We need to learn to obey. He's going to talk about the parent-child relationship first, and that's where I'm going to focus most of my time. I'm going to try to manage time properly here. And then if we get there, then we'll look at this slave-master relationship, or in a sense, the employee-employer relationship. And I may have to do that just fairly quickly because I really want to spend some time on this parent-child one, okay? Let me read verses 1 through 9 of chapter 6. It says, children, obey your... By the way, how many of you are children? Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. That, here's why you should do that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. Now, here's the balancing statement to that. And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Servants. Now, the King James translate that as servants. It's really the word for slave. You know, we're talking about a slave and a master relationship here. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in singleness of your heart as unto Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing the service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive the Lord, whether he be bond or free. And you masters, now here's the balancing statement with the servants. And you masters, do the same things unto them, forbearing, threatening, knowing that your master also in heaven, that is in heaven, neither is there respect of persons with him. All right, here's what he says. Children, and remember, how many of us are children? Yeah, all of us. Okay, children, he says, obey your parents. That's a definite statement here. Children are supposed to obey their parents. It's an ongoing obedience. It's not an ending thing. It's the idea that we as children are always supposed to obey our parents, at least as long as they're alive. He says, obey them. Now that word, okay, I'm sorry. I got going here. All right. Well, on the concept here, at home and at work. This is lesson number 12. We got 2 more weeks. We're going to take on chapter 13, or lesson 13. Here we go. Exhortations to children first. Obey means to hear under. Now remember, we talked about that word submission. It means somebody who is under. So this obedience thing is connected with this idea of submission. We're supposed to hear under. A child is supposed to be underneath his parents' authority, listening to what they say, and then doing it. That's what obedience is, listening with an idea of, okay, I need to find out what they want me to do, and then doing it, this idea of submission. Now, he started that back in chapter 5, verse 21. Remember, we looked at this already. Submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. Now he's carrying this submission idea on. Remember that submission is an evidence of spirit control. If I'm letting the Holy Spirit control my life, what that means is I'm going to be mutually submissive or mutually submissive to each other as Christians. What that means is the wives are going to submit to the husbands are going to submit to God, the children are going to submit to parents, and then if we get there, he's going to talk about slaves and masters. The slaves are supposed to submit to the master, and the master is supposed to submit to God. It's this evidence of somebody who is under the control of God's Holy Spirit. And it just says, obey. That's our responsibility as children to obey our parents. Well, what's the parent's responsibility? Well, Proverbs says, train up a child in the way he should go. God has so arranged life that a husband and wife marry, they have children, and then they become responsible to train and raise that children for Jesus Christ. That's why the child is to obey the parent, because God's given the responsibility to the parent to lead that child in the right way. The child should obey the parent. Now, he says here that it should be in the Lord. Now, that's sometimes a little bit hard to interpret what he's meaning there, because that word in means with regard to. All right? So a child is supposed to obey his parents with regard to the Lord. I think it could be 2 ideas here. Number 1, it could mean that the child is supposed to obey the parent because the child is a Christian, and he's understood this concept of spirit-controlled mutual submission. And so he says, okay, God has set up this relationship here of authority where the husband is the head of the wife, and now I, as a child, need to respond to my parents. And so with regard to parents, he says, look, I'm a Christian. I need to obey my parents because God set it up that way. I think there's another idea, though, that I would kind of lean towards. A child ought to obey his parents as he would obey the Lord. In other words, a child looking at his parents, this child's been put in this home with this set of parents, and this set of parents have been given responsibility by God to raise this child, and so the child needs to look at his parents and say, I'm going to obey you just like I would obey God. Now you say, well, how do you get that idea? Well, because he's already said that several times. He says, wives, submit to your husbands as you would to the Lord. He says, husbands, you're supposed to love your wife like Christ loved the church. He says, now children, you're supposed to, I think he's saying here, you need to obey your parents as if you were obeying the Lord. And then he's going to say it again. We'll look at here just a little bit. Slaves and masters also need to be obedient because they need to recognize they have authority in heaven. They need to obey as they would the Lord. So I think what he's telling us children here is we need to see our parents as representatives of God, and we as children need to obey them. All right? So in other words, Dad's your God in the home. Right? No, okay. But children need to see the idea there that the parents have been put there in God's place to raise them. Now, again, I think we have to do a little qualifying here because, it says in the Lord, and just as we did with the parents, the wives a couple weeks ago, I think the idea there is a child obeys his parents as long as his parents are leading them in a godly manner. If a parent asks a child to do something ungodly, that child has a responsibility to obey God first, parents second. I think we have to look at that idea. But he says here in verse 1, this is right. Now, what's it mean? If this is right, that means this is the right thing to do. In other words, it's a good thing to do. The child recognizes his place in the home, and he's going to obey that parent as that parent leads him in a godly lifestyle. And Paul says here, this is the right thing to do. We'll see that a little bit more here as we kind of go through here. In other words, the idea, folks, is that we as children need to obey our parents. All righty? We need to obey what they say. Now, I think that means some things for our parents. And this is where I'm adding to the lesson here. I'm going to do that a lot on this lesson. Is that okay? Can you add to the lesson? Don't add to Scripture, but you can add to the lesson. We had a good friend when we were out in Nebraska. He was a pastor named Dr. Glenn Jaspers. And he was preaching on this passage one time. And he read that verse, children, obey your parents. And then he made this really, really deep theological statement. Parents, give them something to obey. Now that's deep, isn't it? If children are supposed to obey their parents, what that means is parents are going to have to give their children something to obey. They're going to have to set up some rules and directions. Again, we'll talk about that in a moment. But we as parents are going to have to lead our children in the way and give them something to obey. So he says, first of all, kids, you need to obey your parents. Secondly, he says, kids need to honor their parents. What's it mean to honor somebody? It means to hold them in high esteem. It means to look at them as somebody who is a valuable person, somebody who I can respect and somebody who I can hold up to and look up to as somebody who I can revere. He says, children, honor your parents. And again, folks, this is an ongoing statement. As long as we have parents on the earth, we are supposed to be obedient to them. And we are supposed to honor them. You say, well, look, my parents are in a nursing home. Okay, can you still honor them? Can you still hold them up with respect and esteem as the people that brought you into the world? Sure. When he says we as children need to honor our parents, it's something we're going to have to simply decide that we are going to do. Now, you know as well as I do that, when you're a kid and your dad says, take out the trash, you want to say, forget it, man. I'm not hauling that stinky stuff out there, Or I understand that. But here's the thing, and I'm going to give you some thoughts here a little bit more. Parents, we got to endure to the end, and thou shalt be saved, okay? I know, you got kids, and then they turn into these monsters, called teenagers. You know what Mark Twain said, right? Mark Twain said, when a kid turns 12, build your wooden box and put the kid in there and just make a hole big enough to poke a little food through. And then when he turned 13, plug up the hole. I know, some of you feel that way, all right? Now, folks, I think this is true because, I taught high school kids for the last century, and I have seen many of those high school kids that, they're in high school, they want to do their own thing, all that kind of stuff, and their parents are dumb and stupid and they won't let them do all this kind of stuff, okay? And then they go off to college or go off to the military, and you know what they do? They call home. I used to say they write letters to home, but you don't do that anymore, They call home or they text home and say, Mom and Dad, thanks for raising me the way you did. Because you were right. We have 2 daughters. Our younger daughter is the more rebellious one. And she didn't always want to do what we told her to do. But now that she's away and she got off to college and she's away, honestly, folks, Karen and I could do no wrong. She just thinks we are the epitome of everything, okay? So hang in there. Maybe they're not honoring you right now the way that you want them to, but they will. If you raise them right, they are going to follow and they're going to return to you with honor. Just hang in there. Don't give up, okay? He says, though, here, there's a promise for kids that do that, and that's down in verse 3. That it may be well with thee, there's the first one, and thou mayest live long on the earth. Here's what he's saying to kids. He said, kids, if you'll obey your parents, it's going to go well with you. In other words, you're going to be able to live a good life. You're going to get the idea that you need to be submissive to authority. And you need to follow the directions of those people that God put in your life. And there's going to be a whole lot less conflict in your life if you'll recognize this idea, I as a person need to submit to the authorities that God put in my life. He said you'll be able to live a good kind of life and that you will live long on the earth because your parents won't kill you. I had a good friend named John Brooks, and he was an assistant pastor at church we were at. And, he would talk to me and he says, Bob, I could never be a teacher. They'd all be dead. Now, folks, in other words, you can live a long kind of life if you be willing to follow the Lord. So here's a couple questions. When is the child free from the duty to honor his parents? What do you think? When is a child free from the duty to honor his parents? Never. You're right. Never. We can always honor our parents. Here's a second question. Can a Christian child honor an ungodly, unsaved parent? Sure. That child, even though the parent's not saved, that child can recognize, hey, you're the people that brought me into this world. You're the people that are giving me my food. You're giving me my household. Maybe I don't like you. Maybe you don't treat me the way I really want. But I can recognize what you do for me, and I can illustrate the love of Christ back to you, even though you're not giving love to me. He can be an example for Jesus Christ. Now, folks, what that's going to take is it's going to take Spirit-controlled children. Just like it's going to take Spirit-controlled husbands and Spirit-controlled wives, it's going to take a Spirit-controlled child to do that. But that's Paul's commands, in a sense, really, to kids. What about parents? And I want to spend a lot of time on this one, so hang in here with me, okay? Now he balances this out in verse 4. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Here's the balance. He did that with wives. Wives, submit to your husbands, but you husbands better love that wife. Children, obey your parents, but you parents better raise that child and be dealing with that child the way they ought to. Okay, he says, provoke, and he's specifically speaking to fathers here. Who's the head of the home? Mom? No, dad, right? I mean, he says that, he said it up there, the husband is the head of the wife, verse 23. Dad's the head of the home. So he's addressing fathers, but I think it applies to both. He says, provoke not your children to wrath. You know what it means to provoke somebody? Just irritate them to death, right? Remember when you were in class and you had one of those kids, there was a clicker, and it just drove you crazy, right? You remember when you used to count the number of times the teacher said, or something like that? Yeah, it just drove you nuts, okay, because that irritates you. There are certain things that irritate me, whatever. Okay, he says, dads, don't do that to your kids. It literally means to rouse somebody to wrath or anger. Don't do things as a parent, as a father, that's going to arouse wrath in your kids. Now, I got a whole list of what possibilities they may be here. I'm adding to the lesson, okay? How does a parent provoke his child to anger? I wrote down a few things. By being harsh and critical all the time. Always harsh, never showing love. Always critical, you're never going to do things right. You're an idiot and all that kind of stuff. Being harsh and critical. Not living a Christ-like life in front of your kids can provoke anger. When you're not self-controlled yourself. Making unreasonable demands that that the child can never live up to. When you set the standard up here and there's no way that child could ever reach that standard, you're going to provoke anger in that child. Here's one I think we do a lot. Demeaning and humiliating the child. Calling him an idiot, calling him stupid, calling him incompetent. And especially doing that in front of his friends. That provokes anger in the heart of a child. Not being willing to listen when they're trying to explain something to you. Why did you do that? Whatever. And the kid's trying to explain to you, but you say, look, I'm dad, whatever. And not being willing to listen. Demanding they be what you want them to be instead of what God's trying to make them to be. When a parent puts all these expectations on a child and pushes him in a direction that maybe God's not leading that child or that child has no interest in, folks, that creates anger in the heart of a child. Not living up ourselves to the things that we ask them to do. You ever heard of this guy named Abraham Lincoln? I think he was... Forget it. I was going to be stupid. Okay. Abraham Lincoln said, the best way to bring up a child and the way he should go is to go that way yourself. I've got to be an example of Christ if I want my children to follow Christ. Here's the big one, guys. This is probably one of the hardest ones that's going to provoke anger in kids. That's being inconsistent in our discipline. Inconsistent. One day, the kid does this and you don't say anything. The next day, the kid does that and you slap him across the room. The kid doesn't know what to think. I did that yesterday. Being inconsistent. And folks, it's extremely difficult to be consistent in that discipline. I'm going to talk about this next one a little bit later on. Not giving them quality, undivided time where the child knows they have your complete attention. Where that child knows he can come to you and ask you a question, and you're going to put everything else aside and focus in on that child. He says, look, I can't talk to my dad. I can't talk to my mom. They never listen. Paul said this same thing in Colossians 3:21. He says, fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. And that word discouraged means disheartened, to lose heart. In other words, what I as a parent can do is I can so provoke anger in the heart of my child that they give up on this whole bit of trying to follow Jesus Christ and obeying the Lord. They just say, look, it's impossible. I can't do it. Look at my dad. If dad represents Christ, then why would I want to follow Christ when I can't even please my dad? So we got to be careful, dads. We got to be careful. When we're raising those children, we don't provoke anger in their hearts. And then he says, He tells us what to do. That was what not to do. He tells us what to do. He says, bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. This is what we dads and parents are supposed to do. We are supposed to nurture them. Now, remember last week we talked about husbands, and it says you're supposed to love your wife as your own body, and it says who doesn't nourish his own body, right? Did you guys nourish your bodies this morning? We had men's meeting yesterday. We nourished and nourished and nourished. I think there were 900 donuts. And I know some guys nourish themselves on donuts excessively, all right? Yeah, we nourish our bodies. Now, it's the same word, folks. Just as a guy is going to nourish and feed his body, we're supposed to feed our kids. Now, he's not talking about physical food there. He's talking about training our children in their character and their minds. We're supposed to teach them godly living. We're supposed to train their character to be submissive to Christ and submissive to you as a parent. That's our job, is to nourish them in the Lord and train them in the Lord. But then he also says, the admonition of the Lord. You know what that is. That's when that finger comes out and says, you shouldn't do that. That's the correction. Admonition is the warning. You say, well, look, I don't want to repress their personality. Do it anyway, okay? If you do that kind of stuff, you're going to be looked upon as narrow-minded and legalistic. So what? Our job is to train them on how to go and then admonish them to go that direction. That's the job of a parent. It's discipline, and I know nobody likes discipline, folks. Nobody likes to do it, and nobody likes to be the recipient of it, but is it necessary? Absolutely. He says, dads, don't provoke them to anger. Now, in other words, don't do angry discipline, but we do have to discipline. We do have to teach, and we do have to train. Folks, we have to, as parents and grandparents, we have to counter the of this world. All of us, but particularly our kids, are being flooded with the world's philosophy. It's coming through social media. It's coming through movies. It's coming through TV. It's coming through books. It's coming through their friends, folks. You as a Christian parent have to counter that philosophy. You've got to correct that philosophy. Otherwise, folks, we are going down the tube and we're going to just live the same kind of life that everybody else does. So how do you do that? Okay, I added to the lesson here. How do you do that? Let me give you some ideas. Have a family mealtime where the whole family gets together. Say that's impossible. Make it possible. Have a time when you and mom and dad and the kids all sit down at the table and have a meal together. Take all the phones and devices and put them in the garage. Okay? Get them out of there. Have a family meal and talk to each other. Ask questions like, standard questions like, hey, what was the most important thing that happened to you today? And everybody go around the table and say, yeah, this is what happened to me and this, okay? Ask questions like, and standard questions so they know that's coming. Who were you able to help today? What did you do for somebody that was helpful to them? You see, once you start asking those questions repeatedly, they get the idea that they're going to get asked that question, and so they're going to do something to help somebody so they can go to the table and say, I did so-and-so. And by the way, don't let them get away with, I don't know. Make them, all right? Talk over stuff. Every person could give something they did, and so forth. In other words, have a family meal together and just talk together as a family. Talk about family vacations you want to take or goals that you want to do as a family, but talk together, folks. It's vital. We don't do this anymore. You know, everybody's hitting McDonald's or, well, you don't want to do that. You know, whatever, okay? Number 2, keep all the devices out of the bedroom at night. Your kids will scream and they'll holler. They will. But you know, after a while, many of them will come back and say, you know, I'm sleeping a lot better because my phone's not dinging all night and I'm not tempted to get up there and check Instagram and all that kind of stuff. Keep the phones out of the room at night. Monitor their devices. What in the world are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact, folks, that you as a parent are responsible for what your kids are looking at on their smartphones. You need to know what they're looking at. You need to know where they're going. All right? Here's a suggestion that if you're going to give your kid a smartphone, and I'm not saying that you always ought to, help them understand that is your phone, not theirs. You're going to let them use it, but it's your phone. And if you want to take it away, you can. If you want to look at it, you can. Because it's not their phone, it's your phone. You get the idea? Because they're going to get taught a lot of stuff over that phone. And again, I've already mentioned this. Be wholeheartedly available to your kids. You know, talk together, spend time together, do things together, talk about life together. You know, one of the things that, you know, just last week, okay? One of the things that happened there at the Capitol, with all that stuff going on, there should have been a family conversation over what happened there, where parents are instructing their children about what went on there, what was wrong about that situation, what did they do, what should they have done instead of storming the Capitol. You know what, the whole situation there, dads and moms can talk to their kids. Now here's one, folks, and you know, on this one, don't shut them down when they ask questions, particularly about your faith. Dad, why do you believe in God? I can't see him anywhere. You know, it's not, man, you know, he's becoming an atheist. They want answers to those questions. Dad, why do you believe in creation when all my teachers at school tell me that we evolved? They want answers to that. Don't shut them down and say, look, you know, that's because God said so. All right? Give them answers to that kind of thing. Make Christianity attractive. Oh, we're doing great. In other words, when kids see you and they say, and we say we're Christians, they say, wow, I want to be like that. They look at baseball players and football players and stuff like that, and they say, wow, I want to be like that. Why can't they look at a Christian and say, wow, that's what I want to be like? Because we as mom and dad are exhibiting Christian character to our kids. He said, raise up a child in the way he should go, right? I want to run through this next one here, folks. Our daughter sent us, can you read that? Yeah. Sent us this list here. She went to a seminar, and there was a Christian guy there named Ken Brumley. He counsels kids all the time. Here's what he said: the top 10 things your children will say to me in counseling. I saw my parents argue. I never saw them make up. These are things that kids are telling this Christian counselor. They're having trouble. They're going to see a counselor. This is the top 10 things they tell them. I saw my parents argue. I never saw them make up. Number 9, no one taught me the importance of change. No one told me I can't have my way all the time. No one told me I need to change this part of my character to be a better person. My parents never told me that. This is interesting, number 8. My parents stopped telling me stories too soon. In other words, you know, when the kids are younger, I don't like the word stories. I would say accounts from the scriptures, but they stop telling me stories that have a moral value, that teach character. They stop telling me stories too soon. When they get older, maybe in their, late elementary into their teen years. You're not going to maybe tell them stories, but here's what you can do. You can sit down and watch a movie together. That's a story, right? And then you can analyze the movie. What was good about this movie? What was wrong about this movie? What kind of message was this movie trying to convey to you? And is that message biblical or is it not biblical? You can actually, I'm not against entertainment, movies, stuff like that, but I think, folks, they always have to be analyzed to find out if it's true or not. You can do that. My parents stopped telling me stories. Number 7. My parents punish me by withdrawing from me, and I tend to do the same thing. Kids, get out of here, okay? If you're going to behave that way, just go to your room. And they withdrew. Okay, dads, this is a tough one. Young men said I needed more hugs from my dad. You a hugger? Try to be at least a little bit. Young women said, I needed more hugs from my dad. My dad. Moms they're natural huggers, right? Dads aren't. Number 5, I've learned to manipulate my world by watching my parents manipulate each other. I've learned how to manipulate the teacher at school because I saw my mom manipulate my dad. I wish I could have seen more affection between my parents. It would have made me feel more secure. You mean kissing in public? In front of the kids? Yucky. Oh, yeah. Well, does that indicate that, hey, dad loves mom, mom loves dad? Can you hug your wife or whatever, in front of me? Why not? It gives them the idea that you're going to stay together, that you love each other. You're not going to chuck her one day when she gets a little bit larger than she was when you married her, whatever, right? Oh, this was a tough one. I never saw my father cry, except when I pestered him to death. Okay. Number 2, this is a big one. I learned what to do, but not what to be. Kid says, yeah, okay, I know I got to do this and this and this and this and this to please my dad, but I never learned what kind of person to be. In other words, what happened was in that home, it was all performance-based behavior. If you do this and this and this, I'll like you. I'll love you. If you do this over here, I don't care what you do, I'm not going to like you. In other words, the kids learn that they have to do certain things to gain mom and dad's approval and feel valuable in the home. Number 1, our lives were too busy. Number 1, our lives were too busy. Now, folks, I almost said kids, but I know there's a pressure today to be involved in everything that you could possibly get in. There's the Tiddlywink Club, and there's the soccer club, and the baseball club, and the chess club, and we got the idea that we got to get our kids involved in everything so they can be well-rounded, whatever. All right? But folks, we get so involved in that kind of stuff. Do we get involved as a family? Number 1 thing these kids said, our lives were too busy. We didn't spend time together. We didn't spend quality time together. We didn't talk together and play together and maybe even argue together. We didn't do that. Mom was going here, dad was going here, I was going here, brother was going here, and we never got together as a family, folks. It's convicting, isn't it? He says, parents, raise up a child in the way he should go. He exhorted parents to be good parents. What about the servant-master relationship? Now, again, the King James used the word servant. It's actually the word slave. It's the word that's used for slave. And he's going to tell how a slave ought to relate to his master. Now, we're going to kind of generalize a little bit and say this is how an employee ought to relate to his employer. Okay, but the comparison's really not there. All right? How many of you are slaves at work? Okay, you'd have to raise your hand. Okay. It's not quite the same, but here's the idea. If a slave ought to treat his master this way, surely an employee can treat his employer this way. Got the idea? All right. So what is he saying here? He says in verse 5, servants or slaves, be obedient, there it is again, to them that are your masters, according to the flesh. He said, servants, slaves, you're supposed to obey. Same word as used for children. Obey them. Be somebody that adheres under the authority. The authority, master says this is what I want you to do. I listen to it as a slave. I say, that's what I need to do. I'm going to go out and do it. Obey them that have mastery over you. He tells you how to do that. All righty, verse 5. First of all, he says, with fear and trembling. Now, I don't think he's meaning scared to death, he's going to beat me if I don't think he's talking about that. I think he's talking about the idea of humility, where a slave recognizes that he is under this master, and he's not the big shot, he's not the show off, he's not the guy in charge, he doesn't have a cocky attitude. He recognizes that he is underneath that master, and he takes the submissive position. In other words, he doesn't gripe about his boss, he doesn't complain about his boss, he takes that submission. An employee is under the employer and needs to obey that employer. He says, in singleness of heart. In other words, not pretense, not hypocrisy. Honestly and sincerely, he's going to give his best effort to do that job. Well, I don't want to do that job. Did the master tell you to do that job? Yeah, okay, then do the job and do it to the best that you can. I told you some stories about when I was a laborer. I was not always a laborer at Union Carbide Chemicals and Plastics Corporation. There was one summer when I was a wiper. You know what a wiper is? Okay, Union Carbide put in this brand new multi-million-dollar machine to bottle Prestone antifreeze because Carbide made Prestone, okay? And so they had this thing, and it would come through, and the bottles would come through this machine, and it would fill them up with Prestone, and then it'd put the cap on it, and it'd screw the cap on, and then it'd come around this conveyor. But the thing didn't work right, and it dumped Prestone all over the bottle. So you had to have a wiper. So one whole summer, I wiped Prestone off of antifreeze bottles. Was I excited? Whoopee! Not really, but it was a job. The job, the foreman said, do it, so I did. In singleness of heart, you do it and give your best effort at it. Now, he's going to say this, look at here in verse 5. As unto Christ. Verse 6, but as the servants of Christ. Verse 7, doing service as to the Lord. 3 times, folks, 3 times here. He says, slaves, don't see this master as your master, see God as your master. And work as if you're obeying God, not the master. Work as if you were working for God. Crazy, isn't it? But that's what he's telling us as Christians our responsibility is. Work in a manner not necessarily that pleases the master, but work in a manner that pleases God. Because ultimately, folks, who's the ultimate authority? God is. Pleasing Christ is more important than pleasing the boss. He says, do it with goodwill, verse 7. With goodwill. In other words, with a good mindset, with a good heart. Not fussing, griping, complaining. That crazy boss, he doesn't know what he's doing, stuff. I mean, I wish he was down here one time doing this, wiping these bottles, and he'd know what wiping bottles is like. Yeah, I should. Well, no. Oh, no, he says, do it with goodwill, with a good mindset, with a good attitude, with a good heart. And then he gives two negatives. Not with eye service. Now, you all know what I'm talking about here, right? There's a famous person, I can't remember who it was, but he said this: everybody's looking for work until they find it. Right? Everybody wants a job, but they don't want to work. We had I did work at one factory for a while, and we made automotive headliner. You know what that stuff is? Nobody knows what that is. That's the stuff on the top of the inside of your car. We made that stuff down there in South Carolina. And we had this kid that came in, he was a new hire. He came in at 8 o'clock. He went to lunch at 12 and never came back. Where'd he go? I don't know, but he's not here, Men pleasers, only working when the boss is looking. That's a men pleaser. He says, that's eye service. Not as men pleasers. You know the guy that always is trying to impress the boss so he can kind of get a little perk or a little raise or something like that? He said, no, don't do that. Folks, it's going to take a spirit-controlled person to do this. Now, he gives us an encouragement here. Let me tell you, he gives us some encouragement here. He says, not as men pleasers. All right, here we go. Back up. That is, folks, that ultimately the reward is not going to come from the master. The reward is not going to come from the boss. The reward is going to come from God. And if I can work this job and please God, the reward comes from him, knowing that whatsoever good any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord. And now he talks to the masters, the bosses, the employers. He says, you guys do the same things. In other words, you masters, you need to work with fear and trembling. You need to work with singleness of heart. You need to work like you're working for Christ. You need to work as not a men pleaser. You need to work as not with eye service. You need to do the same thing. And then he tells you why. Last part of verse 9. Knowing that your master also is in heaven, neither is there respect of persons with him. In other words, if you're an employer, if you're a boss, you're a foreman, you need to understand that you're working for Christ and not just for the plant, not just for the person. You're working for Christ here. And you need to understand that he is your master and he holds all people equally, and you need to treat the people the same. Now, folks, that's going to take a spirit-controlled master to do that. So here's our question. All right. How you doing? Grade yourself, A or F, on how you're doing following God's commands to children, parents, employees, and employers. Lord, you gave us some really important thoughts here, some really important thoughts on raising kids. I pray that you would help us to be godly examples in our home, that we can make Christianity attractive to our kids, to those that are around us, that in the workplace, that we as workers would work diligently as if we're working for you, that at the foremans and the masters and the bosses would realize that they have a master in heaven and they need to treat people properly, not with threatening like we looked at there, but with love and concern. Help us to be examples for Christ in this world. We pray in thy name. Amen.